My brother always got what he wanted, but now I wonder if our rivalry is worth losing family. Growing up, my brother, Josh, was the golden child. He had this way of always getting what he wanted, like the world bent itself to his desires. It wasn't just that he was charming or clever, he was. But it went beyond that. Our parents, for reasons I could never quite understand, seemed to cater to his every whim. New bike? Sure. Extra dessert? No problem. When it came to me, though, things were different. I learned early on that if Josh and I both wanted something, Josh would get it. Birthdays were the worst. He'd get expensive gifts, a new gaming console, the latest sneakers, while I got practical things, like clothes or books. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't ungrateful, but it was hard not to feel like an afterthought when every event seemed like it was about him. Even family vacations were planned around what Josh liked to do. If he wanted to go skiing, we'd hit the mountains. If I suggested a beach trip, suddenly it wasn't the right time of year. As the younger sibling, I was used to being overshadowed. But what really stung was how easily Josh manipulated our parents without them even noticing. He'd do something wrong, like break curfew or skip out on chores, and somehow, by the end of the conversation, he'd walk away without any consequences, while I was left cleaning up his mess. One time, when we were in high school, Josh crashed the family car. It was a minor accident, no one got hurt, but the car was wrecked. I remember thinking, finally, he's going to get in trouble for this. But when my parents found out, Josh spun some story about how it wasn't really his fault, how he was trying to avoid a dog that had run into the street. My parents, instead of grounding him or taking away his privileges, actually felt bad for him. A week later, they got him a new car, one even better than the one he had crashed. Meanwhile, I had to save up for months just to buy a used car. I worked part-time jobs all through high school to pay for gas and insurance, while Josh cruised around in a brand new vehicle, courtesy of our parents. It wasn't just the material things that hurt. It was the sense that, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough. I'd get good grades, sometimes even better than Josh, but all anyone talked about was how well he was doing on the football team or how popular he was at school. Even at family gatherings, relatives would fawn over Josh's accomplishments, barely asking me about mine. If I brought it up, I was told to stop being so sensitive or let Josh have his moment. As we got older, the dynamic didn't change. Josh breezed through college, funded by our parents, while I had to take out loans. I worked part-time jobs while studying just to make ends meet, but Josh lived in a fancy apartment our parents paid for. And somehow, even though he barely passed his classes, everyone was still so proud of him. It wasn't just jealousy. I wanted to be happy for my brother, but it was hard to watch him coast through life, reaping all the rewards, while I struggled for every small victory. I thought things might change once we became adults, that maybe our parents would see us more as equals. But even then, Josh seemed to get everything handed to him. I remember when he landed his first job, thanks to a connection my dad had with someone in the company. Josh barely had to interview, and the job was his. Meanwhile, I sent out dozens of applications, went on countless interviews, and faced rejection after rejection before I finally secured a position. And even then, it didn't feel like much of a win. What frustrated me most was how blind our parents were to the imbalance. Anytime I tried to bring it up, they'd dismiss it, saying things like, "You're both special in your own way," or "Life's not a competition." But it always felt like only Josh was the one winning, and I wasn't even on the scoreboard. As the years went by, the resentment built up, simmering just beneath the surface. I kept it to myself, trying not to let it affect my relationship with Josh. But it was hard. Every time he got something new, every time he succeeded with little effort, it reminded me of how hard I had to fight for the things I had. And no matter how much I accomplished on my own, it never seemed to be enough, not for my parents, and certainly not for myself. By the time we both reached our late 20s, I was starting to feel like I had been cheated out of more than just material things. It was about the validation, the acknowledgement of my struggles, the recognition that I had worked hard to get where I was. But for my parents, it seemed like Josh was still the star of the show, and I was just a supporting character in his life. Little did I know, everything was about to come to a head. The dynamics that had defined our family for years were about to shift in ways none of us could have predicted, and for once, I wasn't going to stand by and let Josh take everything. As the years went on, I tried to push down my resentment, but it wasn't easy. Josh was always the one with the spotlight, the one who received praise and support without lifting a finger. I was the one working twice as hard for half the recognition. By the time I hit my late 20s, I had built a life I was proud of, at least on paper. I had a stable job, my own apartment, and a decent circle of friends. But the bitterness that had been building since childhood stayed with me, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. The tipping point came when my parents decided to sell the family home. They were getting older and wanted to downsize, move somewhere quieter. Josh and I were called over to discuss the sale, and I figured we'd be talking about the logistics, what to do with the furniture, how to help them pack, things like that. What I wasn't prepared for was the bombshell they dropped in the middle of dinner. "We've been thinking," my father said, after a long silence that felt heavy with anticipation, "about what to do with the money from selling the house." I hadn't even considered that angle. In my mind, the money was going toward their retirement, maybe some vacations they'd been wanting to take. But my dad's expression told me there was more to it. "We want to help you both out," he continued, glancing between Josh and me. "You're both at points in your lives where you could use a little extra support." My heart started racing. Was this it? Were they finally going to recognize all the hard work I had put in over the years? Maybe they'd help me pay off my student loans or put a down payment on a house of my own. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that I wasn't going to be left in Josh's shadow. But then my mom spoke up, and my heart sank. "We've decided to give most of the money to Josh," she said, her voice soft, as if she were trying to cushion the blow. "He's been going through a tough time lately, and we think he could use the support." It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I stared at them, trying to process what they had just said. Josh was going through a tough time? What about me? I had been working nonstop for years, barely keeping my head above water, while Josh, who had been living rent-free in our parents' old house for the past year, was once again being handed everything on a silver platter. Josh, of course, didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked slightly smug, like he had known this was coming all along. "Wait," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though I could feel the anger rising in my chest. "You're giving the money to Josh? All of it?" "Not all of it," my mom quickly clarified. "We're going to give you something too. It's just that Josh needs more help right now. You're doing well for yourself, you've got a stable job, your own place." I cut her off before she could finish. "Are you kidding me? I've been busting my ass for years, trying to make something of myself, and you're giving the money to Josh? The guy who's been sitting on his hands, doing nothing?" My dad frowned. "Josh has been struggling. He's had a rough time with his job, and he's struggling?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think I haven't been struggling? I've been working multiple jobs just to stay afloat. I have student loans, bills, things that Josh has never had to worry about because you've been taking care of everything for him." My voice was shaking now, the anger I had bottled up for years finally boiling over. "You've always done this. You've always given Josh everything, and I've been left to fend for myself. I've never asked for anything, and the one time I think maybe, just maybe, you'll see that I could use some help, you go and hand it all to him again." My parents looked taken aback, like they hadn't expected this outburst from me. Maybe they hadn't realized how much their favoritism had affected me, or maybe they just didn't care. Josh, meanwhile, sat there quietly, looking down at his plate, as if this wasn't about him at all. "Calm down," my father said, his tone trying to be soothing, but it only made me angrier. "This isn't about playing favorites. We're just trying to help both of you." "No, you're trying to help Josh," I snapped. "You've always helped Josh. And I've always been the one left to figure things out on my own." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mom opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't take another word of their excuses, of their attempts to justify why Josh was always the golden child while I was left with the scraps. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm done," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "I'm done being second best. You can give Josh whatever you want, but don't expect me to sit here and smile about it." Before they could respond, I grabbed my coat and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood outside, the cool evening air doing nothing to calm the storm inside me. I had always known that Josh was their favorite. But this? This was too much. They were willing to give him everything, even after all these years, while I was left with nothing. As I walked away from the house, my mind raced with questions. How could they not see how unfair this was? How could they justify giving him more when he had always had more? And most importantly, what was I going to do now? After that night, I didn't speak to my parents for weeks. The rage I felt toward them, and Josh, was so consuming that I couldn't even look at my phone without my blood pressure spiking. They tried calling, leaving voicemails apologizing for the misunderstanding and pleading with me to come over and talk things out. I ignored every message. Josh, unsurprisingly, didn't reach out at all. It wasn't like we had ever been close, but this felt different. It felt final, like the last thread of our relationship had been cut. During those weeks of silence, I started reevaluating my entire relationship with my family. I wondered how much of my life I had spent chasing validation that was never going to come. It became clear that my parents had a blind spot when it came to Josh, and no amount of explaining, arguing, or begging was going to change that. They had always put him first, and they always would. The only difference now was that I wasn't going to keep pretending it didn't bother me. One Friday night, after work, I found myself sitting in my small apartment, staring at the half-packed boxes scattered around my living room. I hadn't planned to move, but suddenly it seemed like the only solution. The idea of staying in the same town, constantly reminded of how close Josh and my parents were, both physically and emotionally, was unbearable. I needed to get away, start fresh somewhere far enough that their influence couldn't reach me. The next morning, I started looking at job postings in cities across the country. I knew it would take time to save up enough money to make a big move, but the thought of leaving gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't living in Josh's shadow. I was making a decision for myself, one that didn't involve comparing my life to his or waiting for my parents to notice me. A couple of days later, I got a call from my mom. I almost didn't answer, but something inside me told me it was time to confront them, once and for all. I hesitated, then picked up. "Hello? Oh, thank God," my mom said, her voice filled with relief. "I've been so worried about you. We haven't heard from you in weeks, and what do you want, Mom?" I cut her off, not in the mood for small talk. There was a pause. "We just want to talk. Can you come over for dinner tonight? Your father and I have been talking, and we want to fix this. We didn't mean to hurt you." I wasn't sure if I believed her. The memory of that dinner, of them casually handing everything to Josh while I sat there like a fool, was still too fresh. But part of me wanted closure, even if it meant walking into a conversation I knew might end in disappointment. "I'll come," I said, my voice cold. "But I'm not promising anything." That evening, I drove to their house, well, soon to be their former house, feeling a mixture of dread and anger. I wasn't ready to forgive them, but I was ready to say what I had been holding back for years. When I arrived, my parents were already sitting at the dining room table, the same one where they had dropped the inheritance bombshell. This time, though, it was just the three of us. Josh wasn't there, which made sense. He didn't need to be a part of this. He had already won. My mom started the conversation, her tone soft and apologetic. "We didn't mean to make you feel like we don't appreciate everything you've done. We're proud of you, and we know you've worked hard." "Then why did you give the money to Josh?" I asked bluntly, cutting through the pleasantries. "Why does he always get everything, while I have to struggle for every little thing?" My dad sighed heavily. "It's not about playing favorites, I swear. Josh, he's not as strong as you. He's been having a rough time, and we just wanted to help him." I let out a bitter laugh. "Not as strong? You're kidding, right? He's never had to be strong because you've always bailed him out. I'm the one who's been strong, who's been taking care of myself while you've been holding his hand through every mistake he's made." My mom reached out, placing a hand on my arm, but I pulled away. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We just thought Josh needed the support more right now." "And I don't?" My voice cracked, and I hated how vulnerable I felt in that moment. "Do you have any idea how hard it's been for me? I've been working nonstop, trying to pay off loans, trying to make a life for myself, while you've been giving Josh everything. It's not fair, and it's never been fair." The room fell silent. My parents exchanged glances, but neither of them said anything. I could tell they didn't have an answer for me. Maybe they didn't even understand what I was asking for. "I'm done," I said finally, standing up. "I'm done competing for your approval, done waiting for you to see me the way you see Josh. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine." My mom's eyes filled with tears. "Please, don't go like this. We love you." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I know you do. But sometimes, love isn't enough." With that, I walked out of the house, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I wasn't going to waste any more time fighting for something that was never going to change. Josh could have everything, the money, the attention, the favor. I didn't need it anymore. As I drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of years of resentment was finally lifting, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. In the weeks that followed, I distanced myself completely from my family. I didn't answer their calls or texts. I didn't go to family gatherings or drop by for a quick visit like I used to. I'd cut the cord, and while it was painful, it also felt like a long overdue step in taking control of my own life. The constant comparisons, the never-ending favoritism, the lingering resentment, it all began to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of independence. But despite my best efforts to move on, there was still a gnawing feeling deep inside me, a sense that something was left unresolved. I kept thinking about that last conversation with my parents, the tears in my mom's eyes, my dad's defeated silence. Part of me wanted to forget about them, but another part, the part that had spent my entire life seeking their approval, couldn't let go completely. One afternoon, while scrolling through my phone aimlessly, I got a message from an unfamiliar number. For a second, I thought it might be a work-related contact, but when I opened it, I saw a picture of Josh. It was a selfie of him sitting in what looked like a hospital room, his face pale and tired. Underneath the picture was a simple message: "Can we talk?" My stomach dropped. Hospital? What had happened? For a moment, I considered ignoring it, chalking it up to another one of Josh's schemes to get attention. But the image of him sitting there, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen, gnawed at me. What if this time it was serious? After a few minutes of internal debate, I texted back, "What's going on?" His response came almost immediately. "I'm in the hospital. Can you come?" Before I could stop myself, I was already grabbing my jacket and keys, heading out the door. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, whatever it was, I couldn't stay away. For years, I had been holding on to this idea that Josh was the villain in my story, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe I needed to hear him out. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. I hadn't seen or spoken to Josh since the night I stormed out of our parents' house. As I pulled into the parking lot, my mind raced with questions. Was he seriously ill? Had something happened? Was this all just another plea for attention? When I finally found Josh's room, I hesitated outside the door. I wasn't sure what I was walking into. But there was no turning back now. I knocked lightly and opened the door. Josh was lying in the bed, hooked up to N4, looking thinner than I remembered. He glanced up when I walked in, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You came," he said, his voice weak. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, what happened?" He sighed and looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. "I've been in and out of the hospital for a few weeks now. Kidney failure. They're talking about dialysis if things don't improve." The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. Kidney failure? I had never imagined Josh, the guy who had always coasted through life with everything handed to him, facing something like this. Suddenly, all of my resentment and anger seemed trivial in comparison. I didn't know," I said quietly, still processing the news. Josh gave a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, well, I didn't exactly tell anyone. Didn't want to worry Mom and Dad more than they already were." I sat down in the chair next to his bed, the tension between us still palpable but different now, softer, less sharp. "Why didn't you tell me?" He shrugged, looking away. "I figured you wouldn't care." That stung, but I couldn't blame him for thinking that way. After everything that had happened, after all the times I had kept my distance and let the bitterness build, why would he think I cared? "I'm sorry," I said, surprising even myself. "For everything. I shouldn't have let things get so bad between us." Josh looked at me, his eyes tired but sincere. "I'm sorry too. I know I've been a screw-up, and I know I've had it easier than you. I didn't mean for things to turn out this way." The room was quiet for a moment as we both sat with the weight of our words. It wasn't some magical moment where years of hurt suddenly disappeared, but it was a start, a small crack in the wall that had been built between us for so long. "What are you going to do now?" I asked, trying to shift the conversation to something more practical. He sighed again. "I don't know. I'm on a transplant list, but it could take years. I'm just trying to get through each day." I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't a doctor, and I couldn't fix his kidneys, but maybe there was something I could do. "Do Mom and Dad know?" I asked. Josh nodded. "Yeah, they've been here a lot. They're just not here right now." I hesitated before speaking again, not sure how to approach the topic. "Listen, I know things have been messed up between us for a long time, but if you need help, I'm here." Josh looked at me, and for the first time in years, there was no tension in his eyes, no smugness, no superiority. Just vulnerability. "I appreciate that," he said softly. "I really do." As I sat there, watching my brother, my younger brother, the one I had spent my entire life resenting, I realized that life was too short to hold on to grudges. Maybe Josh and I would never be best friends, maybe we'd never have the kind of relationship other siblings had, but we didn't need to keep tearing each other down either. At the end of the day, we were family, and whether I liked it or not, that meant something. The road to forgiveness wasn't going to be easy, and I wasn't sure I was even ready to fully forgive him yet. But sitting there in that hospital room, I knew I had taken the first step toward letting go of the past and looking toward the future, whatever that might hold for both of us. Weeks passed since my visit to the hospital. Josh was still battling his health, and our parents hovered around him, worried but trying to stay positive. Despite the years of tension between us, something shifted after that day. I found myself checking in on him, even sitting by his side when the weight of his condition felt too heavy for him to bear alone. It wasn't easy. The resentment I had carried for so long didn't just vanish, but it felt less important now. Watching Josh struggle with something beyond his control made me realize that life had a way of forcing us to let go of old grudges, whether we wanted to or not. He wasn't the untouchable golden child anymore. He was just my brother, facing something I wouldn't wish on anyone. One afternoon, we sat together in silence, the sound of machines softly beeping around us. Josh broke the quiet first. "You know, I never wanted things to be like this between us." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fear he was trying to hide, the exhaustion in his eyes. "Me neither," I said quietly. He nodded, and that was enough. We didn't need a long conversation or some grand gesture. In that moment, sitting there in that hospital room, we both understood that whatever had been broken between us might never be fully repaired, but we were willing to try. And that was something. As I walked out of the hospital that day, the weight of the past felt lighter. I wasn't chasing my parents' approval anymore, wasn't competing with Josh for scraps of their attention. For the first time, I felt like I was living for myself, free of the bitterness that had defined me for so long. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect, but I was ready to start a new chapter, with or without the approval I had once craved.